My name is Kim Hui Neo, Managing Director at the World Economic Forum, and welcome to the Betazone on Can Tech Deliver on its Climate and Nature Promise? So to answer this question, we have to look at it from two angles. One is, what are these technological innovations and solutions? Right, and for many years, we've heard about blockchain for supply chain and commodities markets. We've heard about remote sensing for measurement, monitoring, and management. We've heard about synthetic biology for new materials and regeneration, and also advanced technological capabilities, whether it's carbon capture, battery storage, so on and so forth. Then the second aspect of this question is, for it to really deliver on its nature and climate crisis, is can we actually bring these solutions to market and to implementation? And here, when we're dealing with the nature and climate crisis, we are talking about speed, scale, right? We're also talking about affordability and bankability, sustainability of these solutions, right? And to help me answer this question today, I have with me two very distinguished speakers, Jane Burston, who's the CEO and founder of the Clean Air Fund, and Melissa Lott, who's the Director for Research at the Columbia University Center for Global Energy Policy. And I'll just introduce Jane first, and then after that, Melissa will come on stage. Jane has been an advocate and ambassador for climate change since she was very, very young. If you read her Wikipedia page, and in fact, she was the first to actually set up a global corporate alliance on clean air. And clean air is almost what we'll call the silent killer. And the surprising statistic, or rather the shocking statistic, is that more than 90% of us actually live in environments that are polluted, right? And the question is, can we actually address the issue of pollution, air pollution, right, to better improve human health and also help build us onto this sustainability journey through technology? So Jane, if you could help us share your insights. Thank you.
Thank you. So when we think about climate technology, we tend to think about renewable energy or carbon capture and storage or electric vehicles. And I bet nobody thinks about little plastic monitors in the shape of a Pac-Man ghost or sensors that you might be able to hide in a school kid's backpack. But I'm here to tell you about how these kinds of technologies could be transformative for the climate agenda. First of all, though, because I know we're after lunch, a bit of audience participation. Who in the room is worried about climate change? A couple of people not. I wish I were you, but mostly worry about climate change. Thank you. And I want you to raise your hands again if climate change has factored into your decision-making over the last week. So maybe what you did at the weekend before you came, how you got here, what you chose for lunch. Anybody factored climate change? Okay, this is the climate crowd, so we're not doing too badly, but I would say at least half, maybe a bit less than half of those hands. Well, we're not unusual with regards to our levels of concern. This chart shows what percentage of people around the world say that they're somewhat or very concerned about climate change. And you can see it's quite a lot all over the world. South America, it's more than, the dark red is more than 80% of people worried. Africa, more than 70% in most places, same in India. So really high levels of concern. But not in all cases is concern translating into action. Oftentimes, the most climate-friendly solutions are less affordable, more hassle than the high carbon alternatives. And it makes it hard for us to choose them on a day-to-day basis. Governments need to implement the policies to make them cheaper and easier, but to do that, they need people behind them. So how are we going to get climate change more personal and galvanize people behind these policies that governments need to implement? Well, the answer might lie, maybe, in air pollution. Because the causes of air pollution are very often the same as the causes of climate change. In fact, about 2/3 of outdoor air pollution is from burning fossil fuels. So if the causes are the same, then the solutions can be the same. But unlike climate change, air pollution is local, it's immediate, and it's personal. You know, the health impacts are huge, and they're affecting our everyday lives. And health impacts are the kinds of things that might change our decisions day to day. You'll see from this chart that outdoor air pollution, according to the WHO, causes early death in more than 4 million people every year, more than tuberculosis, HIV and AIDS, and malaria combined. And it's also causing a huge number of chronic illnesses that are making people's quality of life lower. Think about asthma, lung cancer, heart attacks, strokes, and more recent, very shocking evidence around the links to miscarriages, Parkinson's disease, and dementia. So bearing in mind these awful health statistics, how are people translating it into their day-to-day lives, and how is it galvanizing action? Well, we know that we're all affected. As well as these statistics, we know from the WHO that 98% of us are breathing harmful air. But we don't tend to engage with those statistics. One of the reasons is this. This is a regulatory grade air quality monitor. It's not accessible to your average person. It's big, it's expensive, hundreds of thousands of dollars are spent on buying these and maintaining them, and it needs experts to use it. And what that means is there aren't very many of them, actually. There's, especially in the parts of the world that are the most polluting, or most polluted, or where pollution is growing the most. It also means that it's usually only scientists and policymakers that ever really look at the data. And that's where technologies like this come in. This is an air beam sensor from an NGO called Habitat Map in the States, but there's many technologies like this. And they're small, they're portable, they're cheap. With a little bit of application, anyone can use one. And people are using them to measure their personal exposure to air pollution for the first time. We can track our exposure in real time, breath by breath. And that's exactly what these young people across Africa are doing. As part of a project led by Professor Tolu Oni, who co-chairs the Clean Air GFC, these young people in Lagos, Accra, and Cape Town are using monitors like these to literally run around their city, collecting data about the levels of air pollution and snapping photos of what the sources are and feeding that back to their governments. And as a result, the governments have already started to commit to more official monitoring, but also projects to reduce pollution in their neighborhoods. Think of it like this. When computers meant, the IBM supercomputers of the 80s, computing wasn't the kind of thing that we would have in our everyday lives. It wouldn't affect us. But with the advent of the first iPhone in 2007, which this one is not, there have been a lot of iterations since, it really put the data and the power of that data in our hands. And these kinds of monitors can do the same. It just depends on us to figure out what we do with it. So one last example before I close.
Breathe London was a project focused on understanding the air quality problem in London. We developed this bespoke air quality sensor integrated into a backpack so that 5 different schools around London could be part of that research and understand the exposure levels of school children on their journeys to and from school.
So this project managed to calculate that children are exposed to 5 times more air pollution on their journey to school than when they're in the classroom. But that also, by taking the back streets rather than the main road to school, they could avoid a lot of that exposure. And the evidence from this project, as well as the support of the school children and the families and the communities that were part of it, is what's enabled the Mayor of London to expand the ultra-low emission zone. So it's a clean air zone now covering 10 million people, the biggest in the world. We know that using technology, we can enable people to measure what they're breathing, and that can galvanize them to demand action, the action that we need not just for clean air and healthier cities, but also to mitigate climate change. So if you're looking for the next best transformative climate technology, you might just be able to fit it in your backpack. Thank you.
Questions for Jane in a moment, but now let me introduce Melissa. Melissa also started young because she's been in the energy space for more than 20 years, right? Looking at policy, technological solutions in new energy systems. And with a very good pulse on the developments, what works, what doesn't, what are the key roadblocks. So I'm hoping to have her share her insights, right, on where are the big bets, what are the good bets, right, and what do you think are the key bottlenecks that we ought to look at when we think about technology solutions, but also more importantly, bringing these solutions to implementation and to scale. Yeah. So Melissa.
So when it comes to solving climate change, we are actually doing a lot. We have more policies than we've ever had before. We're building more renewables, we're building more clean energy than we ever have before. But we are not doing nearly enough when we look at what we need to do to actually bend the curve and to protect human health and the environment. So I want to talk about the speed and the scale of the challenge that's in front of us, because this is something that I don't think we've absorbed, how many things we're talking about building and how quickly we're talking about building them. When we talk about things like net zero, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, the scale and the speed is absolutely massive. And there's not too many examples in our history where we have achieved this type of speed and scale. So when it comes to my work, I work in the energy system. I work across the system in things like power, but also in buildings, also in our industries, and also in transportation. Not just electric vehicles, not just personal vehicles, but also buses, heavy trucks, planes, ships, everything that gives us mobility, everything that moves around. And when we look at all those technologies, what I can say is, first, a bit of good news. That is that we have the technologies we need to actually get on the road to net zero, to make these changes happen. And when we talk about those technologies, what we also know is what are the main things we have to do with those technologies to get us to net zero. So I'm about to summarize literally thousands of studies around the world in 3 pictures. Get ready. So when we look at pathways towards net zero that ensure that our energy systems are affordable, reliable, and clean, not just one of those, but all 3 at once, what we see is that we need to do 3 main things. The first thing is electrify everything that makes sense to electrify. I say that very intentionally because it is not everything in our economies, but it is a lot. And as we do that, we try to become as efficient as possible. The next thing we do is that we clean up our energy supplies. This is all that electricity that we use, but it is also the fuels that we need to actually keep our industry running and to power things like the big planes that go through the air. I'm an engineer. As much as I wish I could tell you I could electrify that, physics gets in the way. This thing called lift just stops happening after a point when you put too many batteries in those systems. So we need to think about cleaning up our energy supplies and how do we do that? So the electricity and everything else, so creating zero carbon fuels. The third thing we do is clean up everything that's left, because the climate cares about you getting to net zero. It doesn't care how close you get if you don't actually get to net zero after some point. We don't end up stabilizing things if we don't get there, so we have to clean up what's left. So this is things like direct air capture, other technologies that can take all the emissions that might come out of a smokestack or just out of the air and putting them underground or creating products with them. It's also nature-based solutions. So we electrify that everything that makes sense to electrify. We clean up all of our supplies, electricity plus a lot of other things. And then we clean up what's left because we can't leave anything behind. And the good news on this is that a lot of the technologies that we need to actually do those things have dropped in price quite a bit. So we have policies that support these technologies, but we also are benefiting from huge drops in renewable energy costs. So the costs of wind and solar, if you told me this was the graph I'd be looking at 20 years ago when I started, I would have said, man, that'd be great. I'm not going to bet a lot of money on it. And I certainly would not have bet on this. The dramatic decline in the cost of lithium-ion batteries and battery technologies more generally. Every week, it seems like I'm reading about a new chemistry and a new breakthrough that's going to allow us to do things we just didn't think was possible that we could do before. So that's the really good news. When it comes to the energy transition, I sum it up in this phrase. I say that when it comes to getting to net zero, it sounds counterintuitive, but we need to build a lot of stuff. I mean a lot of stuff. And we need to do it really quickly. So if I have the technologies I need to get on the road to net zero, I should be in a really great place, right? I've got solar panels and wind turbines. I figured out how to break apart water into hydrogen and oxygen to create fuels for other things in our industry. I'm in a really great place. Except for the reality is that I'm dealing with a lot of other challenges, a lot of non-technical barriers that actually slow down the deployment of those technologies. So I'm talking about things like reliability issues, the inability to build these technologies for a whole host of reasons. The speed at which we're able to build up supply chains, mines, processing, building into the things that we want to use at the end of the day, whether it's that battery in that electric vehicle, that solar panel that might go in a field or on your rooftop or somewhere else, an electrolyzer, any of the above. There's a tremendous amount of stuff that has to be done. It takes coordination. It takes the development of so many steps. It takes money. It takes financing in huge, huge amounts. And at the middle of all this are geopolitics, are different tensions and priorities, because climate is one priority of different communities. So I sum these up as non-technical barriers. And when you combine the technical and the non-technical, what I see is that we still have really real challenges. But here's the good part that I'll end on. We know how to lean into really big challenges. When you look at history, we have mobilized entire parts of economies in response to things that aren't pleasant, like wars and pandemics. The good news is in this case is that we are actually all responding to the same challenge, a challenge that will affect each of us differently, but that will affect each of us. And so when we look at solving these barriers to deploying the technology that we do have and that is available, we have an opportunity to solve this challenge and to give ourselves the opportunity for continued growth and prosperity. I'll leave it there. Okay, yeah, absolutely. Gonna come up.
So I'll now invite Jane and Melissa to come on stage and open the floor to questions or comments. We get chairs. Cool. Any questions from the floor? We'll pass the mic around. Yes, please introduce yourself and then you can make your comment.
Thank you so much to Jane and Melissa. My name is Angel Shu. I'm an associate professor of public policy and the environment. My question was actually to Melissa. It was a really great summary and provided a lot of hope and optimism, but I was wondering why you didn't talk about demand-side responses as part of the solution picture. So I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, so I said it really quickly in a couple of ways. So the first pillar of how we do this is that we electrify everything that makes sense to electrify while becoming as efficient as possible. And efficiency can take a lot of different forms. So it can be doing the same things with less energy. So we know the classic example of replacing a light bulb, where you might have, do you guys remember old light bulbs when you sit around them and they were hot, actually to the touch, you didn't touch them. Now we have LEDs. We can be more efficient and still accomplish the things we want to do. But it's also about shifting when we have demand. So in becoming as efficient as possible, that is my very quick summary of doing things on the demand side that allow us to be more efficient, not just on the demand side, but through the supply side as well. So we're not wasting free electrons, as one example.
Thank you. Was there? Yes. And then there is a question at the back as well.
Hello, my name is Sophie Punte. I'm founder of Smart Waste Center. Thanks both for your presentation. I suppose my main question is, climate seems to be right in everybody's mind as a forefront issue. However, there's other things related to it. Air quality is one of them. Climate change adaptation is another. Development in economies is another one. How do you make sure that, or how can we make sure that we don't lose those other very important issues out of sight, while at the same time making sure we reach our net zero goals? Perhaps a question to both of you.
Yeah. Do you want me to start, or you want to go? So when it comes to these three pillars that I put up, behind all of them is an assumption that we're meeting our sustainable development goals, and we're taking the hundreds of millions of people that don't have access to modern energy, but also the billions of people who don't have access to nearly enough to achieve their development goals, to achieve the life opportunities they want to have open to them. And so behind that, all of those pathways, those three pillars, that is a precondition. We're not just solving climate change, we're also achieving the sustainable development goals.
And Jean?
Yeah, so I'm living that and trying to encourage people to look at where the intersections are the strongest. So not just health and climate, but also equity and development too. So a lot of the stuff that we fund as a philanthropic organization is around the co-benefits and promoting them to the right audience. An example is, even in the UK, we saw that the Environment Department was quite keen on stronger ambient air quality standards, but it was the Finance Ministry that was blocking the move because they thought that there would be a huge cost and very limited financial benefit. The Public Health Authority had calculated it was in the hundreds of millions per year benefit to the health system. But actually the productivity benefit of having people not have to stay off work sick because they're ill because of air pollution or because their kids are off sick with air pollution was huge. It was, for the UK, if they were to meet World Health Organization guideline limits at the time from where the current standards were, it was 1.6 billion sterling a year from when the targets was met. So that's not an eradication of pollution. That's just meeting a reasonable target. And on development, it's the same. You know, air pollution affects crop yields, it affects solar yields, affects tourism. There's so many different sectors that are affected that maybe people don't know about, that if you promote those co-benefits, then you can get actions that are a win-win.
Totally. And a question at the back?
Thank you both. My name is Fatma, and I'm the head of Air Quality Section in the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment. Thank you for the example of the UK. This is really, this message needs to pass to everyone, because when they see it in economic or dollar sign, they're all afraid from changing the standards. But anyway, just an information for all of the audience here. UAE have almost 54 ambient stations around the country, and this is one of the biggest network in the MENA region. And the information is accessible, and it's online for all of the public. So just a note for you. And thank you both.
Thank you. I was actually quite curious. How much does this Pac-Man cost?
I don't know whether Tolu can help me out on that. It's in the hundreds of dollars.
Okay.
How much? 200-ish.
Okay. And you're going to see the cost curve come down when more people start carrying around.
I mean, it's worth saying it is absolutely nowhere near as accurate as the big one. They're hundreds of thousands. And then there's somewhere in between. They're called low-cost sensors. They're stationary ones that are maybe $1,000. But you need to factor in the cost of optimizing their location and the energy that they use and so on. So they're maybe not as low cost as they seem, but they're a hell of a lot cheaper than the big one. And it's not about replacing the big ones either. There needs to be a network of lots of different types of monitoring. It's just the new data that it gives us about personal exposure when you can use things that are in the small hundreds of dollars rather than hundreds of thousands.
Yes.
From the beginning till the end, no changes.
Yes, thanks. I have another question to Jane Burston. What I didn't really understand is, you know, I'm coming from Germany. When I look at my app, the weather app, I can also real time see what the pollution is in my area. So why should I use this device in developed countries? I think in other countries it's similar to Germany. Is it a device which is only for developing countries, and then perhaps it's a little bit expensive? Or is it also for developed countries? Or why is it used in London?
Thanks for the question. So air pollution can vary very significantly from street to street. So you might remember I mentioned in London where the kids were using this very sensor actually. Well, no, they were using a Dyson sensor in London. When they took the back streets to school, their pollution levels were significantly lower than on the main road. And it's because some types of pollution are quite heavy, so it sits low to the ground and the wind doesn't blow, the buildings trap it. And so if you're trying to optimize for your health, and you maybe have a little bit more time and these other routes are safe, you can use these personal monitors to decide which is the route that I'm going to take to school today. Also within that project, using this data and some data that Google produced by driving a very high quality monitor around in Street View cars, we were able to produce an incredibly granular map of air quality street by street level across London. And that helped the Mayor's office detect specific hotspots that they could do something about that they didn't know about using the big monitors, which are the number that the weather apps use to produce their data. So even if you had, I think it was, is it 58 monitors across the UAE, I don't know how many London has, it's fewer than that. But they're located at kind of major street junctions, all of the kind of big areas you might expect. So you miss hotspots. You do the modeling and you just don't know what you don't know. So in London, for example, they found that there was a bus station that was a big hotspot because the drivers were idling their vehicles, including when they were on their lunch break, just to stay warm in the London winter, rather than using the staff room. So that's an easy one that you can reduce quickly. It's affecting all of the houses in that neighborhood. They put posters up, they train the bus drivers, they let them know about the availability of the staff room. The hotspot comes down quite quickly. So it's the granularity and the personal exposure that is different than the kind of single figure you get from the regulatory grade monitors through the weather apps.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Any other questions? Yes, and maybe we'll make this the last question. We'll have the mic here.
So I'm just thinking about the UK and
Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Jan Godsell. I'm the Dean of Loughborough Business School in the UK. In the UK, they've just extended the ULEZ zone around London, and it wasn't universally popular. And in fact, some of our political parties have used it as a campaigning tool to potentially not expand it. So what do you think is the role of the media or more general education to perhaps educate or encourage people to care about these things? Because when push really comes to shove, in the UK, for instance, we do have evidence that some people would still go for the cheaper option rather than the option that's better for their health.
Yeah, and I think that is the crux of the matter, really. There's the equity issue of, are people able to afford the new cost that is being imposed on them? So in London, for those who don't know, the ultra-low emission zone is a restriction on which vehicles you can drive into the city. And for the oldest vehicles, you have to pay a fine if you drive in. It was the first 2 times it was expanded, people were pretty happy, and now it's going to the outskirts of London. There's a lot less public transport. So people are asking for more public transport routes. And those boroughs are also less expensive places to live, and maybe people on lower incomes. So the mayor did finally provide a scrappage scheme for vehicles for the people who could least afford to switch, and a commitment to a significant amount of additional bus routes. But it's still tricky for some families or small businesses to afford the change. And I think this was where a lot of the media coverage and discontent came. I think it's also worth saying that the majority of people are in favor. It's just they often end up being silent, a silent majority in favor of the thing that's healthier. And air quality does now seem to be being pulled into the culture wars somewhat. So there are also groups kind of fanning the flames of what were genuinely what were genuine concerns, but making them seem a lot greater than they were.
I'll make a comment just because I was part of the design of the ultra-low emission zone, and back when I worked with the mayor of London before he transitioned to something else. And within it, the loudest opposers of it were, again, very small groups who had very small interests and no ability to transition to the next thing. I remember some very spirited discussion with the duck tours people, for one example, where they were saying, this is the vehicle that is our business. We cannot replace it with something else, so what do we do? So they didn't see a path forward for themselves. In terms of how we brought information, which I think was to your question, to people, I'm part of something called the Lancet Countdown, and we break down at a very local level what these co-impacts that Jane talks about are on air pollution and local health. And within it, we mapped out, one of the most impactful projects we did was mapping out the actual air quality readings, again, at the local level around hospitals, elder care facilities, and educational facilities of children of different ages, but predominantly focused on the under 14s, who are still very much developing their lungs and are completely susceptible to this. And within that, it was the hospital numbers and the elder care facility numbers that, at least the feedback we got back, really were changing public opinion and also providing people with information to say, this is what's happening. I have data on it. I have the numbers, and I can do something about it. And I can actually transition. And I know where that pollution is coming from, how much is transport, how much is some other source. And as Jane said, it comes back to the energy system so often, which includes all the cars that run around the city. So within it, I would say exactly what you said. The conversations would become contentious at the edges. But there was a core of, we know this is harming our health, and we're paying for it in the UK's case through tax dollars, through the national healthcare system, through literally the health of our children and of our society. And we know we can do something about it, which is really powerful.
There's a very strong cultural dimension as well
Huge.
to the implementation of technology. I would like to leave the last comments to both of you. If you were to leave a thought with this audience here, can tech deliver on the climate and nature promise? Jane.
Well, I would echo Melissa's point from before. We have all of the technologies we need. We don't have the political will, which is why I think, to Sophie's question, emphasizing all of the co-benefits of this and trying to maximize areas where there's multiple wins will help us get the political will as fast as we can.
And I often, just carrying on from that, have these conversations where people go, well, those challenges are massive, like geopolitics, finance, moving huge amounts of money around. And when we look at the challenges, by leaning into them and acknowledging how tough they are, that's where we find solutions. Just either acknowledging that there's a problem and walking away, or never acknowledging it in the first place, that's not how we figure out tricky things. And we have a history of figuring out these really sticky issues. So they are huge challenges, but there are solutions, and we will find them when we lean into them.
Thank you. Please thank both of them, Jane and Melissa. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you.